Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Zenshuji 100th Anniversary Lecture Series. This is eighth lectures, and of this August lecture. This August, this season is a special month for especially Japanese and also Japanese Americans. If you stay in Japan in this season, you can see many programs of the related to the World War II, because the World War II ended up the end of the August. So very season for thinking about the World War II. Then after the World War II, people had very painful feelings, but recovered and make it this modern daily life now. That is a part of our history. Today, we have the topic, the theme of the rise of Nisei Buddhism after the World War II. And we are very happy to have the special two speakers. So special speakers, could you, Ron-san, could you introduce the speakers?
Yes, thank you, Kojima-sensei. So hi, everybody. I'm Lon Kurishige. I am one of the three presidents of the Zazen Kai at Zenshuji. And I'm happy to have many of you back, and maybe some of you for the first time, join us for our lecture series, special lecture series for Zenshuji's 100th anniversary. So just to kind of reiterate something I've been talking about all along, is we had three basic themes that we wanted to cover in this lecture series, and not every lecture covers or hits on all three themes. But one was the history of Zen, especially in America, because Zenshuji is a Soto Zen temple. The other is the history of Zenshuji itself, to commemorate its 100th anniversary. And the third theme was the history of Japanese Americans and Buddhism. Because all of these things are connected essentially to Zenshuji's history. So today really fits that third theme about Japanese American history and Japanese American Buddhism more generally. And I thought, John Flores is telling me that my head looks very stretched. I had to pause there. I'm not sure what to do about that. But so I thought about my friend Michael Masatsugu at Towson State, who I've known for a while now, and I've known as the Japanese American historian, or the historian of Japanese American, who's studying Buddhism and the history of Buddhism, particularly Nisei Buddhism. And so the title of this talk today is The Rise of Nisei Buddhism After World War II. As I said, Michael teaches at Towson State in Maryland, and he's associate professor there, as well as director in the program of American Studies, or director of the program of American Studies. And this talk today comes specifically out of his forthcoming book from the University of Hawaii Press called Reorientating the Pure Land, Nisei Buddhism in the Trans-War Years, 1943 to 1965. And I had the honor to be able to read it in advance form, in Microsoft Word form, and would highly recommend it. And Susannah as well will give some comments later, and I'll introduce her in a second. But it's quite a breakthrough to talk about this period during, but especially after World War II, that was so essential to Japanese Americans in general, especially the Nisei generation, and how all of the institutions that we know of, temples and sports leagues and clubs and so forth, really gets cemented in that period and transformed. And this is the era that Michael focuses on in this wonderful forthcoming book. So pay attention to Amazon. Maybe Michael will spread the word about this once it's ready to be purchased. The book is about the history of Japanese American Buddhist struggles for inclusion and community in this crucial period after World War II, especially during the early decades of the Cold War. His current research, so the next book, is going to examine the ways in which the US government officials, as well as Asian lay Buddhists, contributed to the popular understanding of Buddhism during the Cold War. Okay, so Michael's going to talk for about 40 minutes. He's going to present a PowerPoint about kind of hitting the highlights of the book. And then Susannah Duerr, my colleague in Tokyo, who I met when I was at Komozawa earlier this year, Komozawa Daigaku, will give a comment for about 20 minutes on this book. Okay, Susannah is a PhD candidate in religious studies at Duke University. And as I said, she's currently a visiting researcher at Komozawa University in Tokyo, which many of you may know as the main Soto Zen university in Japan. Susannah has previously written about early American Buddhism, particularly the legacy of D.T. Suzuki, D.T. Suzuki's encounter with the Beat generation. Her current research examines contemporary Japanese Buddhism with a focus on the increasing prominence of mindfulness as a practice and concept within Buddhist communities in Japan today. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Michael and let us tell us about Nisei Buddhism.
Well, thank you so much, Lon. I just wanted to say first that I'm very honored to be invited to participate in this series of lectures and conversations to commemorate Zenshuji's 100th anniversary since its founding. And I just want to thank Lon so much for organizing this event and also for his mentorship over the years, and also to Susannah for taking the time to read and comment on this work today. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen. Here, I have a PowerPoint. And as Lon said, my talk today is based on this forthcoming work, Reorienting the Pure Land, Nisei Buddhism in the Trans-War Years, 1943 to 1965. This book is an institutional and social history of the Buddhist Churches of America, or BCA, and of Nikkei Shin Buddhists. And as I think it has a resonance, right? BCA's history with Zenshuji's history, right? I think that the experience that Nikkei Buddhists went through during the war period was a shared experience. This topic grew out of my participation in an oral history project with the Buddhist Church of San Francisco and with the Buddhist Church of America in the 1990s when they were preparing for their 100th celebration. So I think it also speaks to the importance of these kinds of commemorative events like this lecture series today. So this study, Reorienting the Pure Land, extends the histories of the Issei, the Buddhism of the immigrants, the Nikkei immigrants, into the post-war World War II decades. And it addresses the question, what happened after the camp experience? What impact did forced incarceration and resettlement have on Shin Buddhist communities? How did they survive and how did they adapt? So the organization of the talk today, there are four sort of themes that I will address. First, I will provide a brief overview of the impact of forced incarceration and resettlement in shaping adaptations of Shin Buddhist communities. And then I'll look at two specific responses to the challenges faced by BCA's members, and particularly the Nisei, who were sort of thrust into leadership during this period of time. What I call ethnic American Buddhism and family Buddhism. And then next, I will discuss some of the competing post-war visions that Nisei leaders had in thinking about what the Buddhist Churches of America, what BCA could become. And there were these tensions between those who envisioned the organization as a Shin sectarian organization and those who viewed it as a broader trans-sectarian organization that could be an umbrella organization for Buddhism in America. And then finally, I will examine some of the challenges faced by challenges to Nisei Buddhism that emerged in the late 1950s and into the 1960s. So I open the first chapter of my book with a story about the Reverend Issei and Mrs. Shinobu Matsura and their 5 Nisei children, and their return to the Guadalupe Buddhist Church in the aftermath of the incarceration period. And so I thought I would read just a short passage from that chapter, that where Mrs. Matsura describes returning. They had taken a long train. They had to petition the War Relocation Authority. Took a late evening train, boarded for Los Angeles, and the family arrived at the deserted train stop late in the evening, walked to the local Buddhist temple in Guadalupe, carrying a statue of Amida Buddha along with their few possessions. And Shinobu Matsura recalled, "We opened the altar, which had been nailed shut, and entered from the back. When we placed the Amida Buddha in the altar, our great relief and delight were emotions I shall never forget. Early the next morning, the family visited the cemetery. Matsura recalled, voiceless voices beckoned to let us know that all of those buried there were awaiting our return, and we spent a peaceful and quiet time there with them." I opened this chapter with this story to sort of speak to remind us of the worldview that these returnees, right, those who were leaving the camps, the kind of worldview in which they were in and what they were facing, right? And the challenge for the Matsura family was that the Reverend Issei Matsura, like many Issei priests, was arrested by the FBI in the weeks following the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He was sent to a series of Department of Justice camps, separated from his family for a number of years. They were eventually sent to the Hia River camp, right, and separated. And Reverend Issei Matsura was only allowed to reconnect with his family because he had a medical issue, which was misdiagnosed as a stomach ulcer, which turned out to be terminal cancer. And he would not survive many years past the resettlement period, into the resettlement period. But that story speaks to both the importance of Buddhism and the lives of those Buddhists who left the camps, who lived through the camps, left the camps. It also speaks to the resilience of these families, but also to the uncertainty that many faced as they were leaving the camps. So I open with that in my chapter, and to think about, well, what is going to be the state of Issei Buddhism as we move from the internment period to the incarceration period. So forced incarceration, as I believe Duncan Williams has spoken about this in an earlier talk as part of the series, Buddhists were targeted not only based on race, but also based on religion as well in their treatment under the United States Army, and then later under the War Relocation Authority. Buddhism was included as something that made someone suspect of being disloyal. And so being targeted based on race and religion led to a lot of pressure, right? That, as I said, elevated the Nisei to these positions of necessary leadership. Nisei lay leaders held a series of meetings in the aftermath of in the weeks following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, where they made some very drastic decisions and then also actually during the camp period as well. And during these meetings, they transferred property in the name of Nisei citizens, severed formal ties with Nishi Honganji Home Temple, and pledged loyalty to the United States. In the midst of preparation for resettlement, the War Relocation Authority allowed the Nisei lay leaders to travel to Ogden, Utah, to leave the camps, the various camps, and meet in Ogden, Utah to hold more emergency meetings. And during these meetings, these lay leaders changed the name of the organization to the Buddhist Churches of America, and created a national board of directors that would be run only by Nisei citizens. And the one exception to that rule of administration was the inclusion of the Issei bishop, Matsukage, at that time. So these are changes that are leading Nisei to believe that they will very quickly be leading the organization and moving it into a new direction. So this is a picture of a Buddhist hostel at the current location of the Zenshuji Buddhist Temple in Los Angeles. And hostels were created by Buddhists and Christian churches to support returnees after the war. So the resettlement, like the internment, was overseen by the War Relocation Authority in conjunction with Christian relief organizations. And both the WRA and these organizations advocated cultural assimilation to white Christian middle class norms. This was something that this was a transformation that began to take place in the internment camps themselves, but then was part of the policy during resettlement of cultural assimilation, promoting this sort of, they encourage both the dispersion of these communities and the promotion of assimilation. So this led to, again, pressure for Nisei, because Nisei were seen as more assimilated than the Issei, again, so pressure to move into leadership positions. But then Buddhists were also under pressure because they were seen, again, during the resettlement period, as less assimilated than Christians were. And then this led to debates among Nisei leaders as they were leaving the camps. Of course, resettlement for some Nisei began before the end of the war. So and one of the things that I found was that not only was, were these leaders discouraged from using Japanese during services, but they also debated certain aspects of religious practice that might signify as too Japanese during this period. So again, these programs, or the program of resettlement was not just a neutral, it has been described by many as not a neutral program, but for Buddhists, they had this extra burden of trying to conform to what the government and also what these Christian relief organizations were encouraging them to do. In terms of dispersion, the Nisei did not disperse. In fact, they congregated, and they were discouraged from congregating socially and asked to just congregate in terms of their religious practices, but they congregated socially. And so what you see here is an Eastern Young Buddhist League dance in Chicago in 1950. And so these churches and temples that were formed in new places throughout the Midwest, like Chicago, and on the East Coast, became these important centers of both religious and social importance for these communities. Okay, so I am going to now talk a little bit about the responses of these Nisei leaders to the cultural assimilation programs that were initiated by the War Relocation Authority. So the War Relocation Authority's cultural assimilation policies provide a context for understanding the rise of what I call ethnic American Buddhism, right? The blending of symbols of Buddhism with symbols of the nation to make the case for the inclusion of Buddhists and Nikkei as well as part of the nation during a period where there was still persistent anti-Japanese sentiment. Right? So this is a Buddhist funeral service in Tacoma in 1949. And this is a period when, following the celebration of the 442nd, which was sponsored by the Office of War Information, really promoted Nisei and the sacrifices that they made. We have the continuation of this with Buddhist funerals as soldiers who were buried and then buried in Europe and then reinterred in the United States in the late 1940s. Were having funerals, and these became these sorts of public opportunities for families, obviously, to grieve, for communities to grieve, but they also became these opportunities for Buddhists to make claims to inclusion within the American nation. And that's what we begin to see in the late 1940s, and that gets traction also in the media, in the press. And this is a funeral of a private first class George Gushikin, who was killed in France during the war and then was reinterred in 1948. And there was some coverage of his funeral in the Los Angeles Times, which then blended, right, the imagery of the Buddhists with the symbols of the American nation, the casket draped in the flag, the color guard that you see also in this image. But there were limitations to that kind of coverage. Nationally, the only coverage of Gushikin was the casket with his grieving mother, sort of touching the casket, and that circulated nationally, but not this kind of image. This idea of ethnic American Buddhism was very much on the mind of Nisei, who organized a 10-day festival in San Francisco to celebrate 50 years of Buddhism. It was BCA's 50th anniversary in 1948. And this is a photo of the Nisei, lay leaders who participated in organizing this event. It was a 10-day event where Issei were celebrated as pioneers of Bukkyo Tozen, or the eastward spread of Buddhism, where Nisei Buddhist war memorials were visited and Nisei were honored for their sacrifices. And Nisei viewed this as a key moment in the transition from Issei to Nisei leadership. And this group also, it's a younger group of Nisei, right, had this broader vision of what the Buddhist churches of America could be. They thought that their organization would not just be a Shin organization, but would be an organization that would serve as an umbrella organization for general Buddhism in America. And this is in 1948. And you can see the ethnic American vision here on display with the Bon Odori in front of San Francisco City Hall in 1948. And this was this photo is from, or this article was covered in Life magazine. And of course, the Bon Odori had been held in Nihon Machi near the Buddhist Church of San Francisco and Buddhist Church of America headquarters previously, and then also in the internment camps, right? But here, I think the blending of festival with civic space is making a claim, again, to inclusion. And it's something that is being broadcast, right, to, nationally and then also globally in terms of its circulation. In addition to ethnic American Buddhism, Nisei also responded to this call to sort of assimilate through these family Buddhism programs. They're not just responding to what the government is calling for. This is also a product of, demographic shifts and life stage changes among Nisei as they're forming families. But it also very much fit the Cold War domestic containment ideology, the focus on nuclear families that was the baby boom of the 1950s. It also was shaped by demographic shifts among the Nikkei community within BCA, where new temples were being formed, churches and temples were being formed in the Midwest and the East Coast that were predominantly Nisei in these temples, and even in the you also, as a result of greater access to housing and overturning some of the segregation, racial segregation in housing, Nisei are moving into the suburbs as well, and so the new temples, new branches of temples are forming during this period of time. And there's a lot of concern about sort of the dispersion and the losing the connection between these temples and the Buddhist churches of America. So this is, all of this helps to explain why we see these sorts of family Buddhism programs. And this one is about the Butsudan and gathering around the family Butsudan daily. And there are other programs that are about connecting families to the local churches and temples. And on the left is a nuclear family. On the right, we see an extended family, which I think is interesting. And of course, the training of Nisei and other English-speaking ministers was a priority for these Nisei during this period of time, as was the case for the bishops. Here we see Bishop Shigefuji in the center, front center here. It was a priority for them to develop English-speaking ministers. And we see as we moved into the 1960s, I found that this was increasingly a trans-Pacific endeavor organized between the Buddhist Churches of America and Nishi Honganji, the home temple in Kyoto. And the training, initially there was a pre-ministerial training center created in Berkeley, which also housed the Buddhist study group, which I'll say a little bit about in a moment. But that training center, that pre-ministerial training center, then would send the students, the pre-ministerial students, to a temple that was, or actually to a dorm that was created just for students, American students or students from abroad, Nisei students from abroad. It also brought those students together with Japanese students who were training for the ministry and training to possibly go to America. And so they, this is where you have a little bit of interaction, but eventually the endeavor was too expensive. And so BCA, again, working with Nishi Honganji, eventually decided to move the training center back to the United States, to Berkeley. And this is where the Institute for Buddhist Studies was born in 1966, which is still today, a graduate center for a training for Shin Buddhism. Okay. So let me say a little bit about the sectarian versus the trans-sectarian visions that I found. So I argue that the wartime forced incarceration both disrupted and opened up different possibilities for BCA's future. And among these were competing visions among Nisei Shin Buddhists about whether BCA should remain a sectarian Shin organization or should become a more broad, inclusive umbrella organization for Buddhism in America. And there were a number of factors driving these debates. Wartime pressure to disassociate with Japan, the abbot Kosho Otani and Nishi Honganji, a certain cautiousness about the discriminatory policies of the US government toward Buddhists. It made the concept of a Buddhist world that transcended variously lines of ethnicity, race, nation, sectarian, sect, tradition, appealing to some Nisei, including those Nisei who organized, or many of those Nisei who organized the 1948 Golden Jubilee Festival. And here you see sort of an, in this image from the New York YBA's Bliss of Nirvana, this is from 1946, you see this sort of idea of this sort of broader Buddhist world beginning to take shape. Some of that, so this is India Sri Lanka and India in the center here, and then it's sort of emanating out. This is the Bukkyo Tozan idea, but then you see it going in other directions as well, sort of connecting. So this broader Buddhist vision that begins to emerge during this period. In terms of defining BCA as an institution, the trans-sectarian vision for BCA as an institution was short-lived. And Cold War politics really facilitated efforts to reconnect with Abbot Otani and Nishi Honganji. And what you see here is a letter written by Bishop Shigefuji in 1949 to contacts in Japan to sort of make contact with General MacArthur's office and with the American consulate to request that the Abbot Otani be able to visit the United States and to tour the United States and visit the temples and churches. And as a result of the efforts of BCA, and the abbot was able to tour, and he made a number of tours throughout the 1950s. And we see really the consolidation then again of the Shin, of BCA as a Shin organization during this period of time. And that sort of culminated the BCA and Nishi Honganji really coordinated to try to encourage Nisei and overseas Nikkei in general to come to Kyoto in 1961 for 700th memorial services for Shinran. And 1,000 BCA members traveled in 1961, over 1,000, to Kyoto, joining another 1,000 from Brazil, Canada, Hawaii, and other places. And on the left, what you see here is a tour, one of 10 tours, and there was an around the world tour as well, to sort of pilgrimage, right, to Nishi Honganji and to participate in the memorial services. And on the right, you see a report on 700th memorial rites in Kyoto written by Haru Yamaoka, who would be a future, actually the first Nisei American bishop of BCA, who participated in that memorial. So despite the institution defining itself as a strictly Shin organization, this broader vision of connection with other Buddhists persisted. And so this is part of what I also trace in my book. And I think part of the inspiration for a number of people who I interviewed and also in the documents I found was the visit of D.T. Suzuki to San Francisco. A number of them mentioned the impression that he made when he came to speak at he spoke at the American Academy of Asian Studies, which had been established by Alan Watts and Frederick Spiegelberg, but he also spoke at the Buddhist Church of San Francisco in 1950. That was sort of inspiring to them, at least just as an example. The late Dr. Taitetsu Uno recalled that it was, when I asked him why did he go to Japan to study, or why did he go to Tokyo to study Buddhism rather than Ryokoku, he said that it was because D.T. Suzuki encouraged him to go to Tokyo University, and in fact wrote a letter of introduction to Dr. Shinsho Hanayama, who would be a future bishop of BCA, but at the time was a professor at Tokyo University. And that really got him started in his travels. And of course, when he came back, Dr. Uno would be known as a Shin scholar, but also someone who was very interested in this sort of dialogue, right, across Buddhist sects as well. Nisei also participated in a growing global movement for Buddhism that was being led by Buddhist lay leaders in South Asia and Southeast Asia, particularly Ceylon, today Sri Lanka, Burma, today Myanmar, and in Thailand as well. And there was this, and they organized an inaugural conference in 1950. Nisei participated. Even larger numbers participated in the 1952 conference, which was held in Tokyo, and also sort of speaks to the trans-tradition, trans-sectarian, cross-national race, ethnicity sort of vision that the World Fellowship of Buddhists had. And Buddhists who participated in this movement circulated through global networks. And we, for example, the WFB, World Fellowship of Buddhists first president, GP Malalasakara, traveled to the United States, and he, you can see it, there's a picture of Malalasakara with the Bishop Hanayama and Reverend Kanmo Imamura, and down in the bottom, there's with Hiroshi Kashiwagi, participating in conferences. Here on the right, you see a transcript of a memorial service that Malalasakara gave to the 11th Annual Western Young Buddhist League Conference in Exposition Park. So he was circulating and traveling to the United States, and Nisei traveled as well. as part of this, in part of this broader Buddhist world, Reverend Laverne Sasaki had participated in World Fellowship of Buddhist conferences, and then engaged in pilgrimage to India, Nepal, and Ceylon to visit Buddhist pilgrimage sites, and wrote about that, published in a Tokyo journal called The Young East in 1953. But he would eventually be inspired by his trip to, when he wrote a master's thesis, he wrote about Buddhist education for high school seniors, and was a really important and inspiring reverend to the youth when he returned to the United States after his training abroad, in part because he was sort of very much engaged in this broader Buddhist world. And this Buddhist world, or this broader Buddhist vision, for those who were not, those who were sort of engaged in sort of promoting Buddhism across a sect, also, we see the culmination of some of this energy and enthusiasm in the 1952 Buddhist seminar that was held in Berkeley, that brought scholars from the surrounding Bay Area and also participants from the American Academy of Asian Studies together to hear talks on Indian philosophy, on general Buddhism, on Shin Buddhism, and then on Buddhism and psychology. So again, this sort of trans-sectarian spirit and trans-traditional spirit that persisted. And then it also led to it also led to sort of the participation of beat writers and poets as well. So another product of both the impetus to train Nisei ministers, but also to sort of reach out more broadly to across sect and tradition, was we see this in the formation of the Berkeley Buddhist Study Group, led by Reverend Kanmo Imamura and Jane Imamura, as well as Jane's mother, Mrs. Shinobu Matsura. Again, this is an organization that's open to broader discussion of Buddhism and comparative religion. It drew Nisei, the children of Nisei ministers. It drew non-Nisei from surrounding colleges, and it also drew Gary Snyder, who started joining these meetings, learned about the meetings, started to join these meetings in 1953, and then he brought Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and Phil Whalen to these study group meetings, and then they began to publish their work in some of the very earliest work was published in these young Buddhist publications. So I think the earliest Snyder poetry was published in the Berkeley Busse in 1954, and that's a year before the 6 gallery readings and Allen Ginsberg's Howl. And so really, I think the Berkeley Study Group was really sort of onto like what was happening, more broadly in terms of interest in Buddhism in the early 1950s. So I want to close by talking a little bit about the critiques of Nisei Buddhism that emerged in the late 1950s and into the 1960s. So what I found in the late 1950s were debates that sort of emerged around authenticity, the authenticity of the Shin Buddhist practices and the sort of what the community was doing in the 1950s. And I attribute the critiques in part to, I think, an interest among particularly convert Buddhists, who were many of the critics, although there were Nisei and who were also critical of what they saw as the lack of open-mindedness within the mainstream, within the Buddhist churches of America. In part, it was a tension between sort of Shin and Zen and the convert interest in Zen, and Jiriki versus Tariki, self-power versus Tariki, other power. But I think also the criticisms revolved around the sort of adaptations that had been developed. Some of these, going back to the 1920s and 1930s, but others, under the strain of war and wartime incarceration and resettlement. So that ironically, the very markers of Japaneseness that were targeted during World War II now are something that are celebrated. And so when some of these convert Buddhists see this, these sort of what they see as Protestantized Buddhist practice, they're very critical of that because it's not, they see it as not sort of authentic, right? They're criticized for not being authentic. And this is something that I found in publications in the late and exchanges in the late 1950s. And, this went along with the celebration of, beat Buddhism that emerges. Again, this is from the English language flagship publication for the BCA, the American Buddhist. This is 1957, Buddhism in the Beat Generation. And so, Dharma bums being celebrated, and there are a lot of young Nisei who are also sort of excited about what's happening, but others who find what they're reading sort of heretical. I think some more kind of conservative members straying from the sectarianism, the Shin sectarianism, and others who are just saying, who also respond to criticisms by saying, this is part of our longer history here as well. There are also challenges to the Nisei Buddhism, particularly these sort of ethnic American Buddhism, the Cold War liberalism that kind of shapes a lot of these programs as we move into the 1960s. You've got a younger generation of Nisei and Sansei who are more progressive, as well as convert Buddhists. They're inspired by the social movements of the 1960s, the civil rights movement, anti-war activism, second wave feminism. And BCA is somewhat engaged but they're certainly engaged when they protest the brutality of the No regime toward Buddhists in the aftermath of protests by Buddhist monks in 1963. Yet what I found is that they continued to sort of express support for the Kennedy and Johnson policies in Vietnam, even as they sort of hoped for something better for the folks that were for Buddhists in Vietnam. And Nisei and Sansei progressives and progressive convert Buddhists were calling for BCA and its membership to change with the times, to end what they described as the patriarchal and authoritarian practices. And these varied from challenges to the Miss Busei beauty contests to vastly reorganizing structures of institutional governance, and most of all, to take a stronger stance against the Vietnam War. And as a result of, I would say, some disillusionment among some Sansei, you see some Sansei leaving BCA and joining more progressive secular organizations. And others tried to create change from within. And so in one instance, for example, Reverend Imamura, Reverend Kamo Imamura's son, Ryo Imamura, led an anti-war protest in Honolulu in front of the Honpakhanga-ji, where the Senator Daniel Inouye was a guest speaker on Memorial Day. This was in 1968. And the veterans who were there celebrating with them said, well, maybe we shouldn't call the police because I think the guy in the front is the son of the bishop. And in the end, I think Ryo Imamura and Senator Inouye were able to sort of, agree to disagree. And then that was sort of the end of that particular confrontation and that protest. But as I said, for others, they were not very happy with, and so we see this sort of change that is taking place as we move into the 1960s. So just very briefly, I close my book by writing about concerns about the future of American Buddhism, and that's something that's been raised in print and in interviews since the founding of Buddhist communities in America. And so I thought I would just read a very short passage from the conclusion of my book to sort of speak to the persistence both of the Nisei legacy that I write about and diversification of BCA's leadership, as well as the continuing importance of the Buddhist temples and churches in the lives of its members. So I close with the story of Keith Kojimoto, who is a Sansei from the San Francisco Bay Area. And I write, the story of Keith Kojimoto highlights the role that Shin Buddhist temples and their members continue to play in contemplating dying and death and in sustaining and regenerating the Sangha. During most of his life, Kojimoto had little to no contact with Shin Buddhism or the Shin Buddhist community. In contrast, his father Mitz, a Nisei, had grown up around the Buddhist Church of San Francisco in the 1930s. An athletic youth, the father played basketball and attended services. Mitz served as a board member and in various other capacities at the Buddhist Church. As Mitz recollected, the kids are not part of the church. Maybe it's our fault, but maybe those times they always picture or remember the Buddhist church in Japanese. You know, the sutras and all that stuff is kind of hard to hear. Keith grew up a music fan, attending concerts and playing guitar. During high school, he joined anti-war marches and Black Panther rallies. He attended Berkeley in the 60s and joined the Third World Liberation Front strike at Berkeley in 1969. He was a community organizer for years before joining a large Japanese electronics corporation and then a software corporation for 3 decades. Following his father's death in 2009, Keith found himself returning to the Buddhist church. As he recalled of his involvement, when my father passed, they really gave me and our family so much support. Of course, I wanted to give back. In the beginning, it was a little bit social. Over time, he and his wife Priscilla, who was on a spiritual journey exploring Buddhism and Christianity, delved more deeply into Buddhist teachings. Keith noted that since we're both atheists, it kind of struck me that what attracts us to Buddhism, besides the fact that I think the church is still important in the Japanese community, is that maybe through all the political stuff, you lose a little bit of the focus that we're just talking about people. Keith would go on to serve on the board of directors of the Buddhist Church of San Francisco. Keith Kojimoto's gravitation to the Buddhist church and Buddhist teachings highlights the recurring centrality of the Sangha as a living force in the transmission of the Dharma. It is a reminder that the historic struggles of BCA to maintain their temples and congregations and a place in American national culture was always contraposed with the ordinary, everyday struggles faced by sentient beings. So I end my talk there. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Michael. And now let's turn to Susannah Duerr for some comments.
Thank you, Michael. I want to preface my thoughts with the disclaimer that most of my experience on the ground with Japanese Buddhism has been largely restricted to Zen. Lately, as I'm looking into mindfulness, some Vipassana practitioners, and a third and much larger group of Japanese who don't identify as Buddhist, even though they might be interested in Buddhism or do Buddhist practices in their everyday lives. Members of the audience may already be aware, but most people in Japan don't identify as Buddhist or even necessarily as religious or spiritual. Yet Japanese people engage in Buddhist and Shinto practices regularly in their everyday lives. So there's been a debate in the field of Japanese Buddhism about the seeming paradox of many Japanese people not identifying as religious, even as they engage in religious practices on a regular basis. And some of them may even hold certain religious beliefs. What I've taken away from that debate is that our term religion, which referred originally and still privileges the hallmarks of Christianity, fails to encompass Japanese religiosity as it's practiced today. Our idea of religion tends to assume that one must personally identify as a member of a particular religion, whereas Japanese religiosity has long embraced the practice of various religious traditions and practices without necessarily tying those practices to personal identity. So while there are certain exceptions to this rule in Japanese Buddhism today, it's more difficult to talk about what Japanese Buddhists think because so many people who participate in Buddhist practices don't identify as Buddhist. However, because my research is on Japanese Buddhism, I do come into contact with many exceptions to this rule, as well as people who are deeply interested in Buddhist thought and incorporate it into their lives, even if they don't identify as Buddhist. Incidentally, these self-proclaimed, they call themselves Bukkyo fan, or Buddhism fans, have a corollary in America as well, in what the religious studies scholar Thomas Tweed has called nightstand Buddhists, or American who don't identify as Buddhist, but whose nightstands are stacked with Buddhist books that inform their everyday lives and their meditation practice. So this nightstand Buddhism has expanded in recent years with the growing popularity of Vipassana and particularly mindfulness. And that's what my current dissertation research is focused around. Michael asked me before the talk how Buddhists in Japan view or engage with global Buddhism or Buddhism in the West. And my answer to that question is split between two groups of people I encounter here in Japan. Monks and lay Buddhist groups that explicitly identify as Buddhist and those who don't. In the case of the former, there are Japanese Buddhists who understand their mission in terms of Bukbo Tozen, which Michael mentioned earlier in his talk, or the transmission of the Buddhist Dharma eastward, first from India all the way to Japan, and now recently in the past 100 years or so, understood to extend all the way to America, which Michael mentions in chapter 4. A notable example of this is the IZCC, or the International Zen Cultural Center, which you might already be aware of, which is currently fundraising to establish a large Zen temple in Lake County, California. The group's core members include my advisor here in Japan, Seijun Ishii, as well as Gengo Akiba, who's the Issei abbot of the Kojian Oakland Zen Center. And they invite any interested members of the public to meet each month on Zoom to listen to a talk and engage in discussion. So while the Zoom is in Japanese, you can participate in it no matter where you are. So there is some global engagement there. And as far as Japanese Buddhist fans go, they're less interested in spreading Buddhism, which most lay Japanese I meet feel they don't know very much about, but they're interested themselves in learning more about Buddhism. So this includes what they can learn from Buddhists in America. I've recently participated in books clubs that are reading Stephen Murphy Shigematsu's book, From Mindfulness to Heartfulness, and Joan Halifax's book about skillful compassion, Standing at the Edge. American personalities and companies like Steve Jobs and Google are also often invoked by Buddhists and publishers of Buddhist books alike to interest Japanese readers in Buddhist concepts and practices. There are also global conferences in Japan that are trying to bring in a number of Buddhist voices from all around the world in conversation with Japanese Buddhism, including the Japanese offshoot of the American conference Wisdom 2.0. So there's Wisdom 2.0 Japan, as well as a yearly conference held by the organization Zen 2.0, which is actually coming up next month and is fully bilingual if you'd like to participate. I'm going to include a link and some codes later if anyone wants. I talked to the organizer of the conference and he said that he gave me permission to give a $15 coupon to everyone who's attending this talk today. So there are definitely many Japanese people interested in American Buddhism and mindfulness. They're not all of them identify explicitly as Buddhist. I don't think there's an explicit interest in Japanese American Buddhism among many Japanese, mainly because the imagination of America and American Buddhism continues to be more Caucasian or otherwise non-Japanese. So the way most Japanese first access American Buddhist ideas is usually like many convert Americans through books. And in many ways, the phenomenon of nightstand Buddhism is equally as pervasive in Japan as in America, despite the fact that Japanese grow up surrounded by temples and learning about historical developments of Japanese Buddhism in history classes at school. So oddly, many of the Japanese I encounter, with the exception of monks who grew up in temple families, more closely resemble the Nisei or Sansei Buddhists in America, who are more likely to have grown up with some Buddhist practices or exposure to them, but who aren't necessarily themselves ardent Buddhists. One of the biggest differences between these nightstand Buddhists in Japan and the Sansei Buddhists in America involves one of the themes that Michael stresses in his book, community. While Sansei Buddhists can be drawn into a relationship with Buddhism, as Michael just read to us from his last chapter, by encountering the Buddhist communities their parents were part of, in contemporary Japan, the old Danka system in which parishioners support their local temple is dwindling. So Japanese Buddhists regularly go to give offerings and pray at various temples wherever they are in the country, regardless of what temple their family is formally registered with for legal or funerary purposes. So a lot of what I've been seeing here is the creation of new Buddhist communities outside of temple settings, especially communities that can be built entirely online, especially in the midst of the pandemic, which things are still very much in lockdown here in Japan. Despite the countless temples and shrines dotting Japan's landscape, many Japanese seem to share American convert Buddhist focus on books, rather than the local community for connection with the Dharma. And that's, of course, early converts who have yet to join a community. One of the things that struck me as I was reading the first chapter of Michael's book is the zealousness and focus on beliefs of American Nisei Buddhists. While there certainly are more sort of religious Buddhist communities in Japan in that way, depending on where the local community is, I often hear about them as a sort of exception to the rule of how Buddhism is practiced in contemporary Japan. So I wanted to ask Michael, was the language, I was reading a petition that he quoted from 1898 to Nishi Honganji from a community of Nikkei Buddhists. And they said, for those of us living in the United States, there's no possibility of basking in the compassionate light of Buddha. Not only are we unable to hear about the Buddha Dharma in general, we are cut off from enlightenment through the teaching of Jodo Shinshu. Thus, we are unable to understand and appreciate the heart and mind of Shinran Shonin. So I wanted to ask Michael, was this language typical of lay Nisei Buddhists, or was this a minority of older and monastic Nisei? It reminds me of the kind of Buddhism of quite elderly or rural Japanese that's fairly uncommon here among younger generations. From what you've encountered in your research so far, I was wondering, do the Sansei and others in later generations still profess belief and an interest to learn about the doctrine in that way?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I didn't really come across that sort of detailed language, or kind of, well, I shouldn't say. So I guess the context was different in terms of the need for, the context for that was the concerns about, it's that period where there's a lot of concern about, losing, about the immigrant experience and about the fact that, the only people that were really supporting folks in terms of social welfare were Christian missionaries, right, in these immigrant communities. So they're really trying to advocate to bring, try to bring some priests, to San Francisco in that case, I think it was. Yeah, I think there's a lot of discussion of, and a lot of interest in, more, Shin, but also Shin in relation to other traditions that you see in most of the publications that I, read in the, 1950s, 1960s that are coming from, these are English language publications. So it's not so much, you still have contributions from the Issei ministers as well in these, and they're often writing about Shin, and they're often reflecting, I think, the views from, pre-war period training, but also you have circulation of ministers, so that training as well. But you see a lot of interest not only in Shin, but also in Zen, in general Buddhism, in the longer history of, Asian religion, these categories that are then, reified in the West, So, but I think it's pretty exceptional what that particular request and so I don't know of anything like that. That's sort of the key. That's sort of the in the Issei Buddhist history, right? That's sort of the key moment where then the two ministers arrive, right, to San Francisco, and then sort of that's the birth of the Buddhist churches, right, or the BCA or the North American Buddhist Mission. So,
can I jump in here, Susannah? And I don't want to cut
Absolutely.
you off. It seems like
Oh,
what
no.
you're saying is something really profound, and that is to Michael. Did coming to America and going through all the suffering, even before the war, but especially during the war, around being Buddhist and being non-white, did that make them more Buddhist? I think that seems to be what in an American way, where the identity is so entrenched. Did the suffering somehow invigorate or maybe create a devotion that maybe wouldn't be there if they would have stayed in Japan?
Yeah, I think that's true, especially among the group of leaders, right? Because as you're, right, Susannah, because and Delon, because I think that the group that I'm studying are kind of the ones who are trying to keep the temples, churches together, to keep the Sangha together, and you also have a lot of people who are, you know, are drifting or are have left the churches and temples during the war. People in the camps, there are a lot of people who disassociate, right, with the or don't participate. um I guess what's interesting, so I think the folks that I am looking at, the leaders, the lay leaders, are definitely interested in, or maybe perhaps more zealous, although they're also split between the sectarian, those who are stressing sectarian and those who are stressing sort of broader. I think that's also effect of, I think that's also effect of the camp experiences, to say, well, we're not going to be a Japanese Buddhist group. We're going to be a general Buddhist group. We can talk about, and this was, of course, a strategy that Issei ministers used when they were sort of engaged in outreach in the, when they, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, is that, not just talking about, Shin Buddhism, but just talking about general Buddhism, right, to make it more accessible to the public. So it's definitely something that I think I see among lay leaders. And it's harder sometimes to read what broader swaths of people are doing, other than perhaps, attending church occasionally, on Buddhist holidays, and then Buddhist marriages, Buddhist wedding ceremonies, and then home temple, the Butsudan practice, those kinds of things, right, that are connected. And then also, of course, donating money as well to the temples and churches to sort of support them. That's where you also see that kind of more quiet support that may not be as, but the folks that I'm looking at, yeah, I think you're right. There's definitely I suppose a zealousness to keep the temples and churches alive.
Absolutely. And I mean, that makes sense, because that's with any religious group, right? There's going to be a minority that's more personally invested and zealous and making it a part of their identity.
Yeah.
That's actually related. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, please. Sorry.
It's somewhat related to what Lon was saying. In chapter 3, I was struck by how important it is for Nisei Buddhists to understand the religious text meaning, which they weren't able to do because they didn't have the Japanese language. And I saw that as an interesting American departure from the way that Japanese Buddhism was practiced and is practiced today, which is, like, for example, many of the chanting that goes on in Buddhist temples isn't Japanese. It's a sort of a Japanese sounding out of a Chinese sounding out of Sanskrit. And often texts aren't a focus of many lay people, especially at that time. I think now in contemporary, the people who I'm hanging out with are very interested in texts, and that's something that's becoming an international phenomenon. But at the time, I thought it was interesting that an activity that was at least in part a search for connection to their Japanese cultural roots took the form of this particularly American and Protestant emphasis on texts and propositional beliefs as central to religious identity and practice. In a similar vein, the declaration in the Buddhist Busse, which admittedly is not the official publication of the Buddhist Churches of America, about questioning authority really struck me. It said, "The spirit of inquiry must be hampered neither by tradition nor authority. Such a quest is the Buddhist way." I read that and I was just like, I've never heard anything less Japanese in my life. Like, especially thinking of Buddhist institutions in Japan until quite recently. And of course, there are many notable exceptions to this rule. But that sentiment couldn't be further from institutional Buddhism in Japan today, for the most part. It's only been in relatively recent years, for example, that Buddhist scholars here have started to allow for interpretations of canonical texts that contradict what former authorities have written. In the past, it was more like expanding on something or trying to understand the text better, not sort of the emphasis we have in, I feel like, American academia, where we're kind of countering each other in debate and there's criticism. That is not the culture in Japanese academia, and especially Buddhist Japanese academia on the whole.
So this
But I would
underscores
also,
the whole Nisei-ness, right? Or the Sansei-ness, I mean, the Americanness of this adaptation, right?
right. And I think also, you know, the second generation in a new country who has parents with traditions from the old country who in some ways are being reactive to the way in which their parents' culture is different from the surrounding culture. But I would also add the sentiment isn't absent from Japanese Buddhism. It's just more on the fringe, which is perhaps not unlike the Berkeley Busse. I was also struck by the quote by Reverend Kenryo Kumata in the early 1950s, when he stressed the movement of Buddhism from animism to analyzing the existence of the Atman. I was wondering if in any of your interviews or readings, did you come across any Nisei or Sansei who commented on animism at all? Because in Japan, of course, many people interested in Buddhism are interested in Atman and thinking about the self. But almost all Japanese have some level of engagement with Shinto, which is an animistic tradition.
No, it's, again, that's a very unusual quote from, you know, actually, when I think about it, no, there's some coverage, right, of animism and Atman in the Berkeley Busse. So you said Kumata? This is Kumata? Yeah, I feel like, yeah, there is, I think, again, it's the Busse, the Berkeley Busse, probably 1950, 1951. It's not something that I wrote about, but that's probably the only time I came across that in all of the documents that I read. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense, I think, because so much of Shinto is about location and place. So there are places that have spiritual power, or there are places that are worship, like places in the mountains, worshiping the mountains. So it's something that's not as portable as Buddhism, for example.
So I'm going to intervene here. I'm going to let Susannah ask one more question, and then I'm going to, you know, have alert everyone that within 3-4 minutes, we're going to open up the chat, and or you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So you can feel free to start putting it in the chat now, but I'll let Susannah ask the last one.
Oh, and actually, I think my last bit is just a more of a comment than a question. So in chapter 7, which is the last chapter, in which Michael talks about sort of more about the 60s and the pushback against Issei Buddhism by the Nisei, and more strongly and by the convert Buddhists who are critiquing Shin Buddhism and its adaptations. I was struck by the way in which Nisei Buddhism in America was repeatedly held up to the yardstick of American values of political engagement and social services that were modeled by Christian institutions in America. In the same way that Americans to this day are baffled by Japanese Buddhists who are not like religious in the way that we expect them to be. The expectation that religious institutions be at the forefront of social change and political protest was until quite recently entirely foreign to many Buddhists in Asia. What the monks were doing for the people, which was very important, maybe even more important than political activity, was caring for these people in a much deeper and metaphysically huge way. So the Buddhists were seen as playing a more important role than the short-term political. The Buddhists, we're talking about, you know, these innumerable rebirths, and they're taking care of your being throughout those rebirths, not just this one place and this one life. So the relatively recent emergence of engaged Buddhism around the world was in many cases a response to comparisons to Christian missionary institutions established in Asian countries, which is again, Buddhist and Asian institutions being held up to a Christian and American European yardstick, which of course it's great. And many Buddhists want to be engaged today. And that's part of what I research now. And it's wonderful and interesting and important. But to me, critiques of early Asian Buddhist institutions in America for not being politically engaged enough is kind of like critiquing chopsticks for not doing all the things that a fork does. And that is it. I'd love to hear everyone's questions.
We don't have any questions now, but Michael, did you want to reply to Susannah's comments or anything in this discussion so far?
Well, I think to your last comment, I mean, again, you're right. I mean, it speaks to the acculturation, right? And that the yardstick for these Nisei and Sansei are like, Martin Luther King and the SCLC and what the ministers are doing. And I think there is some disappointment that, and perhaps some of my own disappointment that I didn't really see, BCA really only responding to what was happening in terms of civil rights until after Kennedy gives his speech. They didn't participate or even comment on the Freedom Riders, which included, Christian ministers and Jewish rabbis. And so, yeah, I guess it was, but I think you're right. It's absolutely about acculturation and comparing, to religious traditions within the United States as well. Yeah.
Well, let me jump in. We're still waiting for more questions. Does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question? Feel free to do so. You can also raise your hand if you know how to do that, or just literally raise your hand. Okay, well, we're waiting for that. I was wondering, Michael, that at the end there you talked about, is it Keith Kojimoto and his very kind of personal relationship with the Dharma and how he came to that later in life after his father's death. And sort of thinking about your book from that perspective of a practitioner, someone who's a believer or just interested in that sort of interpersonal sort of relationship. I was thinking about something I was just reading. We had Yoko Okamura on last month, and her father, Shohaku Okamura, was part of this really interesting book where they talked about his teacher, Uchiyama Roshi, or Uchimura Roshi, and then his teacher, Sawaki Kodo. And for those of you who don't know, Sawaki Kodo is probably the most well-known Zen practitioner in 20th century Japan. If you go into the museum on Zen at Komozawa University, there's a big carved statue of Sawaki Kodo. Anyways, Okamura starts this book by talking about how Sawaki Kodo was a soldier in the Russo-Japanese War, fighting for Japan against Russia, and killed countless numbers of people. And he never apologized for that. He never regretted it. He embraced his past fully. And yet he's this really profound spiritual leader in Japan. And it just got me thinking about all the Nisei who fought honorably, during World War II, and how we remember them, and how you talked about the funerals and so forth as great American patriots, and how important that was to the ethnic Buddhism that you talked about being accepted and no longer rejected, right, in the US. But did they share with you, or did you, I don't know if you spoke to them, or if when you read the recollections, any personal feelings about war or about killing? And how did that, I don't know if they squared that at all with their faith.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, and I guess the answer is kind of a sad one, which is that I think that these soldiers, their voices kind of get lost in this particular story, because really they are, there aren't the discussions of those. There are certainly interviews with folks, but not with not who were identified as Buddhist. So I don't have those sort of interviews with specific people that, and most of them had passed by the time I was doing this study. So really, most of what I have about them is about them, right? Coverage of them or memorials to them. But I think if I think about, let's see, what I have heard from these soldiers is more within the context also of the time period. So it's framed by, government surveillance, and also, So, people are just kind of on message, I think. In fact, and when I say government surveillance, I mean, yeah, I do have a couple of instances in the book where you get it's not really the voice of the soldier, but someone who's talking about what they're doing as part of a propaganda campaign that's going to then be broadcast across the Pacific and, to other places. So not really a reflective voice after the fact, of how they understood it, that I can think of right now.
Well, it's funny because when I asked that question, I don't even know if that's the right question to ask. Like, are they being bad Buddhists because they've killed? Is Kurosawaki a bad Buddhist because he killed and didn't have remorse and regret? And Susannah and I have had conversations about the sort of criticism in Buddhist scholarship in America, particularly around the criticism of Japanese monks during the war who did not protest, but even more so, vehemently supported the killing machine, the militarist government. But it's a profound question that I just kind of don't even know how to approach. Okumura Roshi's answer in the book was, Kodo Sawaki is dead and he's no longer a threat to anybody. He's not going to kill anyone, but we are still living and we are still threats to whether it's killing or whatever sort of problems that we that we cause. So I find that really interesting. Questions? I feel like I'm on a public radio sort of recruitment drive. Our numbers are still there. We're still open if you want to ask questions. I have a lot more comments. Susannah, feel free to jump in if you have any more questions. You want to go, Susannah?
I think I see a question.
You see a question?
Oh.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that I think we should be very sensitive with each other, and I feel like we have to understand there is going to be a new form of Buddhism, but I don't feel it should replace all the other traditions. That we have to realize these are very ancient traditions, and every day I learn more and more, and with the Japanese practitioners especially, that there's more way to accomplish something than one way. And I kind of look at it as almost like a limitless manifestation of Buddha Dharma. But I feel that we really do need to engage in really deep communication, like you mentioned, Lon, about the man that killed a lot of people. And I think these are all understandable issues in the light of Dharma, but we need a lot of open communication and not judgmental. And that's what I think I learned from Buddha's teaching is we have the right to think for ourselves, and then we have to pay the consequences for our actions. And but I feel we need a lot more gentleness. So that and I'm grateful for this 100-year celebration.
Thank you, Pascal. One quick comment, Michael. You mentioned, and Susannah mentioned this too, especially in your book, you talk a lot about sort of how novel were these trans-sectarian Japanese Buddhist organizations during the war, probably because of the necessities of being incarcerated in these camps, but also after the war, these attempts, whether it's the Berkeley Busei or even the BCA, people talking about more, this isn't just about Jodo Shinshu, it's about broader Buddhism. In fact, at Zenshuji, we're translating the founding of the temple in 1922, and the founder, Isobe Roshi, was involved very much in these trans-sectarian Japanese Buddhist organizations in Los Angeles and throughout the nation, in fact. And so it's not just the Nisei Buddhist thing, it's an Issei Buddhist thing as well, sort of open up. And still today, of course, as many of you know, and Kojima Sensei knows explicitly, they continue to have these trans-sectarian Japanese Buddhist organizations, especially in Los Angeles, but perhaps in other places around the country. And so that's an interesting sort of history there, and how you really provide a lot of data, a lot of evidence for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think these, there were people who participated in the study group who were raised Zen Buddhist, but if you grew up in rural Yakima County in Washington, you were going to probably attend the Shin Temple, their church up there, but so there's that also as well. There's just not as many, right? And so people are looking for something that resembles what they are, that what they believe and practice. So, yeah.
So I see Godwin Sensei has her hand up. So please.
Oh, thank you. I'm curious about if you have thoughts about what Japanese Buddhists in Japan think about missionary temples like Zenshuji, Sokoji, because we're so proud of it here in the States. And they're 100 years old, which to, an American, 100 years seems so old. And my experience traveling in Japan has been people in temples in the northern part of Japan, for instance, rather than Kyoto and Tokyo, excuse me, are very curious about what's happening, but not very aware of our temples. So I just wondered if you have an idea, what do they think about Zenshuji? We're so proud of our missionary temple. Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, it hasn't
Okay.
come up a lot, actually. And I would say it's true that there is a relative lack of awareness of those temples. But I know that there's a lot of happiness here whenever I talk about the fact that there are Buddhist temples in America and that they're gaining in strength institutionally. So definitely there's happiness that Buddhism is spreading to the East. And there's a desire to collaborate, I think.
Good, thank you.
Could I just add something? It's what I found really interesting was that the Buddhist temples in America were definitely on the map of these lay Buddhists in that were part of that World Fellowship of Buddhists, and they would travel to Los Angeles and San Francisco. I think that for them, it was important to have Buddhists that could sort of, share that and promote Buddhism in America, particularly at a time when these, many of these nations who are sort of Buddhist majority nations are emerging from decolonization and, within the context of the Cold War. So they definitely, it was on their map, and they made tours of the United States. So it's interesting that we're in this other moment where Sangha can form like this, as Susannah was saying earlier, but that is one thing that I did find in my study, that they were definitely on the map of these lay Buddhists.
Yeah, I know something that's brought up a lot at ICCC is sort of this question of why was it that the Zen institution here wasn't interested in sending missionaries over to America in the way the Shin Buddhists were? Mm-hmm. So that's something that kind of comes up as a question even among monks today, is kind of like this wistfulness that they wish that it had been that way, and now we're sort of making up for lost time by bringing over the forms of Soto, for example, that are here to America as well, because I think there's a lot that the different communities can learn from each other. There are a lot of ways in which it's practiced differently, even though they may all be in the same sect and reading the same texts.
There's a hand up just on Tuesday. I don't know your name, but you want to ask the question?
Thank you. When you speak of America, are you speaking about the United States, or are you speaking about the entire continent? Like Canada, are you including Canada and Central America and South America?
Yeah.
Because the Latin portion of America has the largest population of Americans on the continent, and there's a huge following of Buddhism and yoga and Hinduism, and our civilizations are older than the United States. But one thing that I kept trying to find the hand, but I couldn't find the hand to raise, with the definition of race, because race is a social construct, and there is no biological marker. There is no genetic marker. So that changes that. But there's not much knowledge of that. There's not much acceptance. And so going from here on forward, does that change the way, well, of course it does, but how would it change?
Yeah.
I guess it would be good, huh? I mean, it would sort of shift the past into more of a past, right? Because
Can I
know,
interrupt? I don't know your name, but Shalom Chess on Tuesday. Do you have a specific question?
Well, okay, we're so grounded in Buddhism, we're so grounded in history and tradition, but with a new definition of race, the fact that it doesn't exist, does that change things?
Yeah, so I would just say that, groups have been, I mean, that even in an era when, because, I'm looking at the 1940s, 1950s, 60s in my book, but even in this era when you still had this sort of biological sort of, essentialist sort of idea about race that was predominant and sort of in some ways culminated in at least an earlier iteration in the 1930s and 1940s. Even then, like, I think that many of the groups that I'm looking at are looking to transcend that idea by bringing people together, So I think that that's what I would say about that. And by America, yeah, I was conflating that with the United States, and I shouldn't have done that. The organization was originally the North American Buddhist Mission, so it actually encompassed Canada and the United States, although there was some interest in Mexico as well of this organization. But there are also a very large Japanese population in Brazil as well. And for that 700th memorial that I mentioned, another 1,000 members of temples in South America, probably Brazil, maybe Chile, and also Canada.
Peru
also
has a
Peru, sorry.
tradition.
Peru and Brazil. Yeah.
Okay, let me pose the last questions about Susannah and Michael. If you can answer briefly, because we only have 3 minutes left. What do you think, Michael? You've talked about second generation Buddhism. What's the future? Third, fourth, fifth generation? And Susannah, I guess the larger question is, what is the future of this kind of Shin Buddhism, Japanese American Buddhism in America? What's your thoughts about that?
The closing story, I was kind of inspired by discussion with Ryo Imamura, or something. It was an interview, something he said, which is that, we get so focused and attached to temples and institutions that we forget that it's about people. And as long as somebody is in need, right, or is suffering, right, there's a place for Buddhism, right? I think that's something I was kind of, in terms of the future. Sometimes there's always been this sort of concern about declension and declining numbers that you read about. Wither Buddhism, what's the future of Buddhism in America among these communities? And I think that's a very profound thing that Ryo Imamura, that sort of thought that it's, as long as people are suffering, there's a place for Buddhism. The other thing is that, and I hear it a little bit in the discussion today, right, is that this question of visibility. I think in the conclusion of the book, I also talk a bit about this debate between Ryo Imamura and in Tricycle. and about, and he's sort of, upset that, hey, this long history of Asian immigrants has been kind of being ignored, and this really brought about a change in tricycle during that period when that was happening. But the visibility is a part of, going back to Chess on Tuesday's comment, the essentialism we have around ideas about who is a American Buddhist, who is an Asian Buddhist, or just the assumption that Asian American Buddhists kind of disrupt that kind of thinking, right? About and so this question of visibility is something that I think is going to continue to kind of be a challenge, but also one that is going to be productive, or could be productive.
Susannah, very briefly, you have some final thoughts?
Yes, I'd say that that one of the interesting things I've seen in some of my research, and even looking at contemporary sort of travel between America and Japan, is that someone arriving from Japan, Nisei Buddhists, for example, and everyone knows this, but of course the Nisei Buddhists are still coming. And what's interesting about the ongoing immigration between the two countries, and the fact that there are converts in America every day who are learning about Buddhism for the first time. There are plenty of places in America where there's practically no exposure to Buddhism. In South Texas, I was very lucky to have met a Buddhist nun. That was extremely rare. And I would say that I kind of hope that even as moving forward, I think there will be a challenge in terms of international exchange between Japan and America. I think from the Japanese perspective, there's going to be this imaginary of a white America. That's especially the fact that Buddhism in America has people like Steve Jobs who are representing it to Japanese, and that's part of the appeal to Japanese are these innovators and sort of famous people who tend to be white Buddhists, tend to be the ones who are more famous and the ones who are printing and being translated into Japanese. So I think that will be difficult to overcome, just because in Japan there is that imaginary of America. But for me, I also hope that it might be possible for sort of something that looks more like ethnic Buddhism to continue in America, because I think there are lots of ways in which Buddhism is not just a set of ideas. It also is community. It also involves these traditions. And I think it adds to the richness of America to have that form of Buddhism, which is less idea focused as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. It's nice to know there's a future for our ethnic Buddhists temples and missions. Very quickly, next month, we have our own Doshin Johnson, who I see 4 squares below me, who is going to give a talk with my colleague from USC, Laurie Meeks, Professor Laurie Meeks. The title of the talk is Encountering Buddhism in North America, Study and Practice. So please join us next month. And now, Kojima Sensei, why don't you close us out?
Thank you, Michael-san and Susannah-san. It was a very interesting talk, and we are very happy to share those things and the discussions. We have different views and different knowledge, but we could share that. That's makes a development to the learning the history and make the futures. That's really happy to hear all of your lectures and other people's voice. Thank you very much for gathering here, and I'd like to see you next month, September 17th again. Thank you very much. ありがとうございました。
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.